Decline in enrollments, school closures, class size and composition, these are all among major education issues we've heard about over the past several years. Now in her third consecutive term as the public spokesperson for BC's 40,000 plus public school teachers, today's guest is at the forefront of advocating for the rights of teachers as well as the quality of public education and learning for students. Irene Lanzinger, President of the BCTF, joins me today as we take the pulse of public education in BC and look at some of the challenges currently facing our public schools. What can be done to ensure our students are obtaining quality education? Are education stakeholders on the same page, moving in the same direction, and able to work together? We ask Irene to share with us her thoughts on what she would like to see done. I'm Paul Shaker, and this is An Education Matter. Joining me on the program today is Irene Lanzinger. Irene, you're in an unusual vantage point to understand what's going on across the province in our public schools. As president of the BCTF now for 3 consecutive terms, you must have traveled every corner, met with thousands of teachers, spoken with them and spoken to them, and met the other stakeholder groups in detail and at length. So given this unusual experience, for a person who's rooted in teaching, as you are as a science teacher, what can you tell us, in your opinion, are the challenges particularly facing our BC public schools?
Well, Paul, there's no question that the largest challenge is around resources. I hear that from teachers everywhere, in every corner of the province. It's different in different places. We don't see in rural parts of the province the class size issues. But everywhere, teachers talk about support for students with special needs. And meeting the needs of that variety of children in your class is the biggest issue for teachers. There's just no question about it. They raise that again and again. And I've said in groups of thousands of teachers many times that this is the biggest issue. And there's never been a single teacher deny that and say, no, this other issue is more important, salary is more important, or the testing issue, which is an important issue for teachers, is more important. Everyone agrees that that's the largest issue for teachers. It's a funding issue. It's, I think, struggling with not having enough resources to feel that every child in your class gets all the support they need to learn as well as they can.
So resources is an issue. Accountability and testing is an issue.
That is another big issue. That's probably number 2 for teachers, for sure.
And is there anything else you'd like to get on the list at this point?
Well, I think, I think the issues are tied together in lots of ways, but I think teachers feel that their ability to manage their class and have some autonomy over their teaching is becoming increasingly an issue for teachers. And as I say, I think that's tied to the other issues. It's tied certainly to the testing issue, which is partly about controlling what teachers do. It's tied to the resources issue, because you can't always teach the way you would like to teach if you don't have the resources to teach. You're forced into certain styles of teaching through lack of resources. And so I think the 3 issues really are all tied together in lots of ways.
As you, I think, know about me, I was head of teacher education in 5 states before I came to Canada. And the issue of inclusion and how to deal with special needs, I've seen a lot of takes on it. Like, for example, in Minnesota, there was a heavy commitment to inclusion. But Minnesota is notoriously not diverse. When I got to California, they faced such great issues having to do with ESL that they'd put inclusion on the back burner. Now in BC, it's a sort of in between the two. Special needs students are funded at a higher level here, but you know, the sky's the limit on really what you could spend and what you could do.
It's true. It's true. There's no end to what you could do in a school system with endless resources, and I think everybody understands that the resources aren't endless. But governments do make choices about how much money schools get. And they make choices about policy. We very much agreed with the policy of inclusion. Teachers in BC are absolutely committed to that that particular education policy, whether it's ESL students or students with special needs. We believe in inclusive classrooms, and we believe everybody benefits from that. But it is an expensive model, and it requires resources for individual children that are outside the classroom. Support teachers like learning assistance teachers, ESL teachers, special education resource teachers, librarians, counselors. Those kinds of support teachers are critical to having that kind of inclusive classroom. And there is no question in my mind that the current level of funding that we have in British Columbia is inadequate to have that kind of inclusive classroom effectively.
That's why the class composition discussion is so important. In Minnesota, I had teachers come to me who were veteran teachers, and they felt that unteachable situations had been created and they were thrust into them because there were so many students with individual needs and individual plans and such a range of ability in something like a math class in 8th or 9th grade that they weren't even sure if there was any supplement to the situation that could make it workable. I don't think BC's gone down the inclusion path to that extent, but it shows what the logical consequence is if you go into this without really thinking about the teacher and their ability to perform.
Yes, and I think this is something that the public doesn't always understand too, that we do not, inclusion doesn't mean that every child is in a regular class every minute of the time. There's a spectrum of inclusion, and we certainly do have some segregated classes for students with special needs. And in some cases, students are in those classes the majority of the day. And even the majority of the week. But they are in the school setting, and those students are included in a school environment, particularly in secondary, that model. So the best kind of system is one where you take each child and you say, what's the best educational program for this child, and to what degree can they be in a regular classroom setting or taken out of that regular classroom setting for some individualized instruction or with another group of special needs students. So if you have a really good system, you take every child, analyze for that child what the greatest degree of inclusion they can have, work with their parents on that issue, and then have the resources to put that program in place for each child. Sometimes we get driven to segregated programs because of resources, and I think that's a pity.
Well, this returns us somewhat to your mention of professional autonomy, because probably no one has better vantage on this than the teachers in a school, and whether they're being heard adequately in the construction of the learning experience for the students is a key factor here, whether their voice has sufficient weight. And I think there's a kind of dualism in the society's response to teachers. On the one hand, they're highly respected members of the community and professional people. They rank very near the top. On the other hand, there is some sort of criticism that comes out of teachers as if they would be feathering their own nest or taking care of themselves ahead of the needs of their students. How do you deal with this duality that we see in the marketplace of ideas?
Yeah, it's interesting because we poll on the issue of public attitude towards teachers, and you're right. When we do that, invariably the public describes teachers as hardworking and dedicated and having a difficult job. On the other hand, when we say we don't want a standardized test in grade 4 and 7 like the Foundation Skills Assessment Test, which we've been very vocal on, we do get some public response that say teachers just don't want to be accountable. And I think that misunderstands the issue of testing. I think teachers feel very accountable to parents, to the public, and to the children they teach. I mean, we don't go into teaching for the money, that's for sure. And teachers are very dedicated to finding the best for each child. But you can't measure that. You can't measure the complexity of teaching with that single test given to 9-year-olds. Teaching and learning is a very complex process, and it has lots of aspects to it. And analyzing how good a teacher is, how well they're doing at teaching, or how good a school is, how well they're meeting the needs of their community, that's a significant issue. How we do that is a complicated thing. And I agree we might have to do better at it. We might have to have better systems at analyzing that. But it certainly can't be done with a single test.
I don't think people realize the gravity of what they're saying when they say that teachers would avoid being evaluated or would seek to escape being responsible for the job they're doing. That's quite a thing to say about a professional person.
Yeah.
And it's not said typically by parents as much as it is by public figures that have some ulterior motive, I think, in, for politically or economically. But for a professional person to actively resist being the best performer at their role that they can be is unconscionable. And they shouldn't be in the profession if that's the way they are.
No, I agree, and it's why we dedicate a significant amount of our resources as the Teachers Federation, and teachers dedicate a significant amount of their own personal resources to professional development, to professional growth. And the best kind of professional development and professional growth is one that is collaborative with other teachers, where we sit down and, well, there are many ways you can develop professionally. Going to lectures and workshops and conferences is one way. But another way that we work on in the Federation is called our program Quality Teach and Teacher Inquiry. And active research, where you sit down with a group of teachers, you set yourselves a problem and a method of researching that problem, you meet over time, discuss your work on that issue, and learn from each other and grow in that way. It's a wonderful means of developing professionally, and we have a kind of extensive program of doing that across the province.
Well, in Manitoba as well as Nebraska, they've tied this into a kind of grassroots classroom-based testing.
Yes.
Where the teachers not only meet with each other, but they develop instruments and validate them through one another. And that rises up from the grassroots then to provide an accountability and testing regime that teachers really buy into.
That's right, and that they feel is informing their teaching, making their teaching better, helping kids learn more effectively, and helping figure out where kids are, because assessment has both of those purposes. It's assessment for learning, but it's also assessment for informing parents about where kids are, informing teachers about the particular position kids are in at a time. So when you can match those assessment tools with your teaching and with the students' learning and with the means of informing parents of the progress of their son or daughter, that's the best kind of assessment and exactly the kind that we're not getting from the standardized testing model.
Ontario seems to have broken the logjam. They have had a sincere communication around a roundtable and reached an accommodation between the stakeholder groups. It's my understanding. Is that correct?
They have come to some agreement around their testing program, though we still do hear some criticisms from the teacher unions around that, and a call, I think an increasing call, to go to a random sample on their standardized test that they give. I think it's at grade 3 and 6 in Ontario. So we hear from them some of the same concerns that we have, but certainly I think they've had a greater degree of cooperation with the government that we've had here.
Yeah, it shows these things can be worked on and progress can be made. That seems very clear from what's gone on in Ontario. And then, as I say, places like Manitoba never have bought into this latest realm of accountability, and they've just consistently had good relations and are satisfied with their schools at a high rate.
Yeah, I think it's really important to work with teachers on these issues, and I think that's been missing. We've had these testing regimes imposed on us without that kind of dialogue and collaborative thinking about where to go with it. And we live in those classrooms every day, and when teachers aren't happy about or comfortable with something that comes down from government, it has a very poor chance of being effectively implemented. It really requires teachers' commitment to something for it to work in classrooms. And so I think it would be great if we could see a higher degree of that kind of collaboration and consultation.
Thank you, Irene. We'll be back in a moment.
For more than 40 years, the Faculty of Education at SFU has been delivering academic programs that are innovative and responsive. Based on the academic research of our professors and the expertise of practicing teachers from your communities, our programs are designed to meet classroom needs. As a community, we're piecing together a successful education experience for students today and in the future.
Welcome back. Irene, we talked a little about professional autonomy in the first segment, And I'd like to delve down into this a little more by asking you about some of the visionary aspects of professional autonomy. What would teachers like to see happening as we go forward in British Columbia education? What changes in curriculum and instruction or the organization of schools? What do you pick up at the professional development seminars that is particularly inspiring to teachers, and what do they ask to learn more about?
Well, it seems to me that sometimes, and I'm a secondary teacher, so I'm going to talk about this from a secondary perspective. We're pretty rigid in our schools, and there's a kind of rigidity that comes about from a secondary timetable. We tend to talk about subject areas, so you do social studies, you do physics, chemistry, mathematics, English, right? And some of the most innovative projects that I've heard about, and something that I think teachers would like to do more of, is do cross-curricular stuff and things that are related to each other and projects that span different subject areas. I've talked to teachers who do some very exciting stuff in that area, but it kind of requires a lot of manipulation and change in this secondary timetable that's quite rigid. And so I think that given some inspiration and some resources, teachers would be very open to those kinds of projects that get outside of that rigid timetable and subject specialty view of learning and go across the curriculum. One teacher I know does some very innovative stuff that crosses social studies, art, and technology, right? With a joint project with the Vancouver Art Gallery. And so it's wonderful to see those things, but sometimes we're so tied up in 4 blocks a day of different subjects that we can't get out of that and see the ways in which subject areas are related to each other and the wonderful ways kids can learn when they have a project that spans many different subject areas. And these things are not particularly new. They kind of come and go in education. I recall in the 70s doing projects, joint projects on, with an English teacher teaching the novel Hiroshima and the physics of atomic science, right? So those kinds of things, I think, are wonderful ways to get kids to think about, for example, the morality of science, the ethical issues in science, and not just the formulas that they learn in a physics class. And that kind of broadens kids' view of the world and makes them understand that things are interrelated. And it would be nice to see something that gave incentives to teachers to look at things across curriculum and got them out of the rigidity of that secondary school timetable.
Ideas really matter, and in history of education, we study about how the assembly line and the notion of industrial efficiency came into education after the turn of the 20th century, and it has become so pervasive by this point that there's more argument toward departmentalizing the elementary school than there is toward integrating the secondary school.
Absolutely.
And all this flies in the face of the way human beings are and relate. We never had a good reason for dumping multi-grade classrooms and even the 1- and 2-room school. We just walked away from these things in emulation of the assembly line, and in the process we dumped all the cooperative learning that was inherent in those models, and at secondary school we lost the relationship between the teacher and the child that we still see in the self-contained classroom. I went this spring to a United Way meeting on middle school age children, and generally middle school is when we start to lose our success rate across North America with children, and it's no coincidence that it occurs at the time when we lose the self-contained classroom. So what you're talking about, I would simply enhance by saying, and yes, let's focus on every teacher having a relationship with a manageable number of students in secondary school. Let's make that homeroom experience expand into a half day or at least a period or so, and that teacher and those students feel some identification with one another so the human aspect of relationship is reintroduced.
I agree with you absolutely, and I would add to that that industrial model, at that assembly line model, had a huge impact on science, and it is the foundation of our current scientific model, scientific method. I went back to do my master's degree before I took a course in the philosophy of science. Having had an undergraduate degree in science and teaching science for many years, it was when I went back to do my master's degree that I was opened up to this huge area of where do these ideas come from? How do they form? How does a current historical and political context form those ideas? And we don't teach kids about that in science education, and I think we should. And I think we should teach it to them in a context where they look at philosophy and writing and English and history and science together and see how ideas are formed. But the way we've structured secondary schools, there are enormous obstacles to doing that. And I think it would be great to have a kind of project where we do, and you're absolutely right about the relationship piece of it. The fundamental piece of educating a child is the relationship that forms between a teacher and a child. It's irreplaceable in terms of helping kids learn. It's connecting with them on that level and developing a rapport with them. Some kids are bright and they'll learn no matter what we do. But helping kids who struggle with the concept, when you establish that rapport with them, that's when you begin to help them learn things.
Well, you see this in the world of athletics and coaches.
Yes.
And how many young people, their big memory is with their coach. And you also see it with the coaches. And many people head into secondary teaching to be a coach because they know in that venue they'll get the personal relationship with the athletes that they won't necessarily get in the classroom. I started as a secondary teacher too, and at first I had 240 students a day, and then I got into a really nice assignment where I only had about 170. But it's only by chance you develop a relationship with some, and it's very hard to feel that you get the credit. You are the person that made that year's advancement for that student, or you have your appropriate portion of that. And so it works not only to take away satisfaction from the teacher, but also to take away the role modeling that the student could experience. These questions get back to issues about foundations. When you talked about not having a course in philosophy of science, most of the other disciplines other than education are not so reflective about their foundations. I was required at one time to build a curriculum for our math teachers at the university I was at. And it was a revelation in the math department for them to think of teaching a foundations of math course. It's just not a question that's typically asked, as you say, especially at the undergraduate level in math or science. We do have that advantage in education. We do question those things. You and I have talked at other times about the role of the public school and the notion of the public good. I'm afraid some of these concepts upon which public schools were built have ebbed in their awareness for the general public and even some of our leaders.
Oh, I agree. When you think about public education, it is the institution in our society that is critical to getting rid of the class system. You know, for many decades and many centuries, and we look back in history, education was available to the rich and not to the poor. Even reading was not available to the poor. And we came to a place, thank goodness, where we decided we should educate everybody. But in fact, I think we may be slipping back, because when you talk to the Minister of Education, she's careful to say, I'm not just the Minister of Public Education. I'm responsible for private schools too. And this government funds private schools. So there is an extent to which they buy into the notion that people who can pay can buy a better education for their children, or at least a more expensive one. I think that we need to, as a society, recognize that the way we're going to build the very best society we can is to make sure that every child has access to a high-quality education. That's fundamental to the principle of public education, and public education is the only thing that can do that for us. Health care is important, but it can't ensure that we have an educated citizenship and that we create equity for everybody. The only institution in society that can create equity for everybody is public education.
It's the only place where the community gets to really express its values to the young and to create a unified society across all religious and cultural lines, and to set up a vision of a democratic society like the one we say is out there in our ideals. I'm very inspired by the attitude of teachers in BC about this, but I am concerned that these embedded values that exist in each school are not prominent enough in the minds of the public at large, and even some of our leaders. They don't realize there is no school without a value agenda. They all have a value agenda. They have to, because there's so many choices made in what you teach and how you teach it. And so it's vital that we have public schools that represent the greatest ideals and the most universal ideals, as you're saying, of our society.
Oh, absolutely. It's critical to democracy, because if you want a democratic society, you have to have the participation of the citizens of that society. And for that participation to occur, people have to understand their rights in that society and their responsibilities. Their responsibilities to be active and to engage and to make decisions together. Democracy is about voting, but it's also about being informed and participating in that society. And that is the fundamental value that we seek to teach in a public education system. And if you're going to teach that value to all children, you need a well-funded public education system. So the extent to which a government shares those values is reflected in the extent to which they fund that public education system and provide the resources to do that level of teaching of values.
Well, one of the key reasons we have this television program is to talk about issues like this, because they are really at the foundation of what we do as teachers, and yet they get forgotten in the public discourse. And that's a very dangerous thing to have happen, because obviously they represent the embedded values of the typical public school teacher. These notions about how we might reform society and the vision that we have for a better world, including all of our citizens, are why we get into teaching, and they are why we object to accountability techniques that do not acknowledge the role of the teacher in promoting these sorts of values.
Yes, absolutely. That accountability agenda would seek to narrow what we teach to a very, a very small set of skills and knowledge that can be tested in many, many cases on a multiple choice test. And it really is such a it reflects such a tiny piece of what we do in public education and doesn't come anywhere close to assessing the kind of richness of what we've talked about today, that values teaching, the cross-curricular, the ideas piece of it. It's hard to test an idea on a multiple choice question on a standardized test. It just doesn't really happen effectively.
Well, we get into teaching to try to make a better world, and that includes every aspect of growth and development in the child, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It is one way of producing a better world is public education, so we have to remain committed to that work, I think.
Thank you, Irene.
Thanks, Paul.
We'll be right back. Once the necessities of life are provided to a child, the school can do its work in providing formal education. The next important variable, according to education researchers, is the quality of our teachers. Superior professionals join and stay in our schools if they are paid a living wage, given appropriate working conditions, and appreciated by their community. Like many other human service professionals, teachers are willing to forego the chance for material wealth if they are provided with an opportunity for middle-class lives, satisfying work, and respect from society. BC is fortunate to have a legacy of pride in its teachers and a body of outstanding professionals in our public schools. Respect and gratitude are important for quality schools, and they aren't measured in tax dollars. Thank you for watching Your Education Matters.
For more information about this show or to view past episodes, go to the Your Education Matters website at www.youreducationmatters.ca. The views and opinions presented in this program are not necessarily those of all faculties, staff, or administration at SFU.